Okay, Liz, what is on your radar today?
Well, this past week, a 26-year-old Californian traveled to Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh's home with a pistol, a knife, and zip ties. He ended up turning himself in front of Kavanaugh's house, admitting to authorities that he'd come to assassinate the justice. He told cops that killing Kavanaugh would, quote, give his life purpose, and that he'd been motivated by the Dobbs draft release, which indicated that the court would soon be overturning long-standing abortion law precedent. Over the next few days, the conservative media went wild, condemning the double standard they'd perceived. But it's not that the mainstream media failed to cover the threat at all. It's that they covered it by relegating it to a tiny tease on the front page, in the case of the New York Times, bearing the actual story all the way on A20. Online, there was one single story about the Kavanaugh plot. The Washington Post had a bit more coverage, but not by much. Conservatives and pro-lifers took to Twitter and the pages of National Review to ask, is this how a foiled plot to assassinate the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have been covered? Or Sonia Sotomayor, or any left-leaning justice who has historically supported expansive rights to abortion? If this had been a liberal Supreme Court justice that someone came to kill, it would have been on the front page, said Bill Maher on his show this past week. And Bill Maher is hardly a paragon of virtue and pro-life sympathy. There's a case to be made that these publications should not glorify the terroristic behavior of madmen or amplify their causes by giving them prominent placement. There's a case to be made that since pro-life extremists have violently targeted abortionists in the past, most notably a spate of killings in the 90s, that such violence stems from radicals on both sides. But this comes on the heels of an awful lot of liberal rhetoric that claims protesting outside of justices' homes is fair game. And it comes on the heels of reports of political violence directed at pro-lifers, something you wouldn't know about if you were just reading the New York Times. Molotov cocktails thrown on Mother's Day damaged a pro-life lobbying group's office in Madison, Wisconsin. If abortions aren't safe, then you aren't either, read the graffiti left on the building. A Christian pregnancy center in Buffalo, New York was firebombed soon after. Just weeks before, Oregon Right to Life had been attacked with Molotov cocktails. The arson plot there, however, was foiled. On June 3rd, a crisis pregnancy center on D.C.'s Capitol Hill was vandalized with red paint and the words, "Jane says revenge." That same day, pro-choice extremists in Illinois burned down an entire crisis pregnancy center there, causing more than $250,000 worth of damage. On June 6th, a crisis pregnancy center in Asheville, North Carolina, had its windows broken. Most of the graffiti mentioned in these situations can be attributed to a national extremist group called Jane's Revenge that has taken credit for many of these attacks. Students for Life representatives have told journalists that college campuses have gotten nastier in response to the leaked Dobbs draft, with male pro-life activists on campus being told by pro-choicers that they're fans of rape or encouraging rape or other profoundly ugly things. And in both Los Angeles and San Francisco, protesters in Handmaid's Tale robes stormed into Catholic Mass, interrupting the sacred time of prayer when religious people are communing with their God. But why haven't you read about this in the New York Times? Why hasn't this recent surge in pro-choice antagonism been documented? Though arson and Molotov cocktails and other forms of property damage are indefensible, protests outside of justices' homes or protests in mass are perhaps uncouth or improper, but in most cases are First Amendment protected activities. Mere antagonism is not illegal, and protecting speech rights is of the utmost importance. When free speech rights are protected for one side, we can rest more assured knowing that they'll be protected for the other in the future. Speech rights ought to be revered even in the most extreme of circumstances when spoken by the most extreme of people. But do note that the media is falling asleep at the wheel when they fail to cover these types of events. It would be easy for right-wingers to allow the chronic inconsistencies of coverage, the chronic media bias, to fuel some sort of reactionary crusade and retreat to reading only right-wing sources. But I, for one, legitimately want the New York Times and others like them to get this right. I don't want them to squander their credibility. I take no joy when I see it happening. The terrible trade-off is that you can either gravitate toward hackish right-wing sources, many of which are indiscriminate in who they'll quote, with non-existent fact-checking departments and a penchant for sensationalist coverage, or you can read the much more credible, much better vetted news purveyed by the New York Times. But it's a newsroom that's probably 95% Democrat, that's likely 95% pro-choice. This homogeneity necessarily shapes their coverage, and on issues like abortion, it not only shapes how they cover it, but what they cover. On the abortion issue, as we prepare for the Dobbs ruling to be released sometimes over the next 2 or 3 weeks, note that neither right-wingers like Tucker Carlson nor left-wingers at the New York Times legitimately represent how most Americans look at the issue. Most Americans are shockingly moderate, even paradoxical in their views, saying they broadly support abortion in the first trimester up until week 12, but don't think it should be allowed during the second or third trimesters. Most Americans are unaware of the laws that we currently have on the books, laws which are, in many states, actually quite out of step with other Western developed nations. Greece, Italy, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Iceland, and many others only allow abortion up until the end of the first trimester. France allows abortion until week 14, as does Spain. In New York, you can get an abortion until week 24 when the fetus is viable. You can get an abortion up until week 24 in California, until week 24 in Illinois, until week 25 in Virginia. But you wouldn't know any of that if you merely paid attention to the loudest voices on both sides. Both sides beclown themselves at best, and at worst, engage in all kinds of nasty and escalatory behavior that raises the temperature on this already heated issue. Pro-lifers ought to take seriously how overturning existing abortion precedent and returning the issues to the states means pregnant women will be despicably scrutinized and surveilled by a state that's newly empowered to investigate their reproductive health. With the advent of easy-to-take abortion pills like misoprostol and mifepristone, and highly accessible antibiotics, and the fact that abortion is actually a fairly simple procedure, we do not have to fear the old 1960s era of back alley abortions. But we do have the state to fear, and the ways the burden of enforcement will necessarily fall harder on poor women than on rich ones, as we so frequently see in our flawed criminal justice system. But pro-choicers, who populate almost the entirety of the mainstream media, ought to take seriously how they squander public trust and betray their ethical commitments when they fail to even mention arson attacks on crisis pregnancy centers. They ought to consider how they squander public trust when they fail to devote very much airtime to foiled plots on the lives of conservative Supreme Court justices. They ought to ask themselves whether they treat these incidents the same way were the political affiliations reversed. They may think they're pulling the wool over people's eyes, but people are a lot smarter than that and notice the dirty obfuscation. Even if viewers and readers don't believe that conservatives are correct in their beliefs, they surely notice the double standard and begin to consider what other things might the mainstream media be lying about. How else are they failing us? Yeah. There's a lot for you to disagree with there.
I mean, not necessarily. So to the first issue of the coverage of this, you know, a lot of these things are very subjective. To your point, there was a front page article in the New York Times about this.
Well, no. There was a little box on the front page.
Right, but most stories start on the front page and move on in the rest of the...
Significant stories actually have a bar, because this didn't have like a whole bar on the front page.
I appreciate that, but a lot of people would say, you know, a front page... A note on the front page of the New York Times is not ignoring the story, even if we think that there might have been more coverage if it were targeting a liberal judge. I think that's perfectly legitimate. I certainly have no disinterest in covering the story because I think, it's not as salacious as some of the other things that have been going on, in part because the guy turned himself in.
Yeah. There doesn't seem to be quite mentally disturbed.
Right. There's not the same proximate threat as in some of these other instances. And I think a lot of other people might also say, okay, well, how much coverage has there been of the 31 Patriot, what are they called?
The Patriot Front.
The Patriot Front members who were pulled over in the Woodward
Pride. A ton of coverage. CNN, I was watching CNN on my flight over to DC, and it was like hours and hours and hours of wall-to-wall.
The question isn't whether CNN covers it, it's whether the conservative papers are doing the same way. So I do think that there are obviously a very deeply politicized and bifurcated news.
But bear in mind that you just said CNN versus the conservative papers.
Right.
The New York Times purports to be the paper of record.
But they're not. I mean, like, no one's pretending. No one's pretending.
But I think it's important for us in the media to note that is how they brand themselves. If they branded themselves as a leftist or a liberal paper of record, that would be a different thing. But they're saying they're one thing when in reality I don't think that's really true. And so they do have a different obligation when that's how they self-identify and self-describe.
Is Fox News painting itself as politically right explicitly, or do we just all understand that it's politically right explicitly?
No, I mean, I think that's part of the deal. Absolutely. I think that's how they package themselves.
I mean, I think that
anybody who has that many Mike Lindell My Pillow ads is like obvious.
But I'm trying to parse the difference between what we all understand, like what we all are understanding about the New York Times, and how people still present themselves as giving the facts, like delivering the news. Ultimately, all of these institutions are presenting themselves as news organizations. But I don't want to belabor the point, because I don't disagree. My chief point is that I think that you're right, that there's obviously biased coverage, but as you go down the list of the crisis center attacks that haven't been covered, I did a quick Google, and apparently there's been a rise in anti-abortion violence on abortion centers. There was an Ohio man in February that pled guilty to threatening an abortion patient.
Which is stuff that you can much more easily find.
No, but I've never heard of this. My point is that I also don't see any of this coverage. I personally have not consumed any of this across the board. And I think that there's a larger conversation about what is considered to be newsworthy in these papers. I'm not entirely convinced that this coverage of this particular issue is super duper partisan. I also think that you make a good point.
So I'm curious though, how do you think it's not super partisan if like for example, like I'm a pro-life person, I'm also like 23 weeks pregnant, and so, you know, it definitely sort of colors the way I think about these things. But I don't think based off of polling my friends at these newsrooms, then also looking at some of the, you know, internal journalist sort of watchdoggy type organizations, you know, these newsrooms are not comprised of pro-life people. How many people in media do you meet who are pro-life, who aren't necessarily even explicitly conservative, but I'm even talking like Democrat pro-lifers or secular pro-lifers? How many of them are employed by these major newsrooms?
I mean, to your own point, a majority of Americans overwhelmingly support abortion through the first trimester, which is part of why this Dobbs holding is so frustrating, because the underlying Mississippi law, which many people were concerned about, ultimately was only a 15-week abortion ban, which was in line with, to your point, what most of the rest of the, you know, Western world already has on the books. In fact, a fun historical quirk is that one of the reasons America has a longer period of time where women can seek abortions is because we don't have the same healthcare system as other countries. And the justices in the early 70s were like, well, American women just need another beat to be able to even access an abortion provider. So I'm with you that even though there is a pro-life newsroom, the majority of Americans in those who are identifying as pro-life are actually very much in line with you and the rest of the world, and only wanting really like a 15-week access to abortion. And the Supreme Court actually went further than what was being demanded, what the underlying case was in Dobbs in Mississippi.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing with the Supreme Court is that it's a federalism issue now. Like, it's being returned to the states, and we have 13 states with trigger laws on the books, which basically mean abortion will be illegal in those states, with exceptions, actually, notably for all of the trigger laws that have been written. Exceptions are there for the life of the mother, and in many cases due to rape and incest as well. But I mean, one of the things that I just keep coming back to is, even if the majority of Americans are in favor of first trimester abortion being allowed and opposed to second trimester abortion being allowed, if the people who are shaping the news and shaping the coverage and the things we read and consume about this, even in a straight news manner, if they're not engaging with actual pro-lifers in their day-to-day lives or in their workplaces, how can we be sure that bias isn't seeping in? As a pro-lifer, I notice that bias constantly, and I have hordes and hordes of friends, journalist friends on Twitter who also notice this exact same thing, and I'm not happy about it, right? Like, I don't want to have to read the Daily Wire to get abortion coverage. I want to read the New York Times because I trust their fact-checking department.
I guess I'm resisting the characterization of the people at the newsrooms as having a left of center position on abortion because they aren't pro-lifers. I think, to your own argument,
I think most of them are probably in favor of abortion being allowed in second trimester and possibly third trimester as well.
But that's not what the polls say, even per your own admission. I think that
I mean, we know journalists skew a little bit further left, and I think in general, like, we have newsrooms that are in places like DC and New York. In New York, I can walk into an abortion clinic right now and get an abortion, and the vast majority of people I know who are New Yorkers are in favor of New York's laws staying exactly the same.
Well, I don't know anything about how far along you are, what New York laws are, but the point of the matter is, I think overwhelming public opinion actually is, you're right, not that far left. And I don't think it's necessarily fair to make claims about what people at newsrooms, who are often very misinformed about what the abortion laws actually are in the books and what exists in other countries, what their views are. The conversation very much is often just centered around Roe, and people want to protect Roe, and polls are about protecting Roe, and Roe protects, you know, through the first trimester with exceptions, et cetera, through the third trimester. But again, we're talking about rape, incest, health of the mother, all of these other kinds of things. And sometimes I think the real issue, I agree with you that there's some concern about how this is reported, but the real issue is that we don't disaggregate what it means to have access to abortion and all the shades within that, and it becomes this black and white issue, in part because the Supreme Court has taken this black and white stance and taken what should be a conversation about a 15-week abortion ban that the legislature tried to pass in Mississippi and turned it into a referendum on whether or not you can protect the right to choose at all in the 13 states with trigger laws in the United States.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We'll have more Rising after this.